Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we're listening to True Disturbing Reddit Posts.
I've never posted to this subreddit before, but after working with authorities, I finally feel safe enough to share my story. For context, I'm a 20-year-old female, and I started an OnlyFans account over the summer to support myself through school, and things were great until I posted my Amazon wish list. Amazon doesn't release your address to people who gift you items, but third-party sellers can, and I believe that that's where I went wrong. By the way, not trying to promote it here. This is a very frightening story, and I felt like it should be shared. In late July, I got a puppy, and one evening around 2 a.m., I took him outside to go to the bathroom. While he was doing his business, I happened to notice a car parked outside my family home. I saw a figure in the car, but I couldn't really make out their face because it was pitch black. But from the way they were facing and the position of the car, it certainly felt like they were looking at me. Feeling a bit uneasy, I picked up my puppy to take him back inside. And once I started to move, that car that was parked inched towards my driveway. I sprinted back inside and locked the door, expecting whoever it was in the car to approach the house, but no knock ever came. The next morning, I went to check the mail, and I found that there was an envelope inside addressed to my OnlyFans name with about $50 in it, but no note. I was currently still at home with my parents who had no idea about my OnlyFans account, so I didn't want to have to explain that, so I just kept it to myself. A few weeks later, I moved back to my college town to get ready for school. At this time, I had stopped posting for the time being until I could figure out how that person got my address. I've watched enough crime shows to know there's a possibility that I could be in danger. I live in a duplex with a gated parking lot, for reference. One morning, I was planning on vlogging my trip to Target because I was planning on starting a YouTube channel in the near future, since OnlyFans now felt unsafe. When I got to my car, I realized that it had been ransacked, and my vlogging camera was now missing. I know it's my fault for leaving it in my car, but I was using it the night before, and since I lived in a gated area, I didn't think that it would be unsafe. It wasn't in plain sight either. I had it hidden in my glove box. I used that camera to film my content, and the SD card inside had all of my unreleased photos and videos. I know that they stole it just for the SD card, but this is where the story gets weird. There are cameras outside in the parking lot, so we were able to watch this person break into my car and find the camera. They didn't happen to touch any of the other 7 cars in the lot. It seemed like they knew which car was mine, which suggests they had been watching me for a while. After they got the camera, they walked around the duplex until stopping near my window. My bedroom faces an outside street, and my blinds happen to be broken, so it's fairly easy to see in. I have a curtain, but it doesn't cover my window all the way. That's when we saw that this person watched me sleep for nearly an hour or so, using the camera they had just pilfered from my car to do the recording. I had no idea why they didn't try to break in, but I thank God that they didn't. This person, whoever it was, then sold the camera to a pawn shop, and since I knew the serial number, the police were able to find it. When I got it back, the camera was still in perfect working order, but predictably, the SD card was missing. I believe the police are still trying to track that person down, but I broke my lease and moved to a new place, so hopefully that will keep me safe. I no longer create content. No longer do I want to have a YouTube following, or literally any type of following now. Part of me wishes that I were more creative and had found a way to make money for school in a different way, instead of putting myself out there the way that I did. But a bigger part of me wishes that online creeps would just stay online and away from me in real life. So a little background information before we start. My father was in the Army for 21 years. He retired and moved to a very small town in Central Florida. He got bored after a couple of years, and even though we didn't need the money between his retirement and what my mom was making as a bookkeeper slash accountant, he wanted to go back to work. He started working at various gas stations, and it being a small town, the owners wouldn't care if I came along and helped him out with stocking the coolers or even running the register, so long as I didn't sell any beer or smokes. This all took place in the late 80s and early 90s. The actual story that I'm going to tell took place in 1990, and I remember the date well because it was shortly after my birthday, and being 15 in Florida, I had just gotten my learner's permit. My dad would let me drive him to and from work just to get some experience on the road during both the day and night. I was sitting in my usual spot at a table in the gas station that was set up along the windows. I had a book in hand, feet propped up, and a Mountain Dew on the table, along with some snacks. I would generally spend most of my evening that way, reading books, getting up to run the register, or stock the cooler at different times. I remember glancing up because something caught my attention that was unusual. I realized that it was a lady walking up to our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. The gas station was right on I-75, if that helps. This in itself was pretty strange, because where we were located, you didn't get many people walking, and definitely not walking from the direction of the interstate. I figured she had broken down somewhere, and was coming to use the phone to call for a tow truck or something along those lines. But I was completely wrong. She walked into the store, looked around for a few minutes, and that's when I remember getting a strange and creepy feeling about her. She walked up next to the counter and began telling my dad this story about how she had become stranded and needed a ride up to the next big town up north from us. Ocala was the town. This is important. My dad lets her know that he's working and there's no way that he can take her. That's when she turns her focus to me. And while she's looking away from him, my dad catches my eye and subtly shakes his head no. I was confused for a moment, but then she turns back to my father and points at me, asking if I can take her. My dad responded back that I only had a learner's permit and wouldn't be able to drive her anywhere and then drive back. Now, normally I would have done it, even though it was illegal, because I'd done it a few times before already. But I didn't argue with my dad, since this was completely out of character for him. He was normally chatty with the customers, but for whatever reason, he was almost curt and dismissive of her. Turns out, he had that bad vibe about her from the moment that he had seen her walking up the drive. Well, she cusses him up and down for a minute, and he basically tells her to get out of the store. She slammed the door open. I thought the glass was going to break from how hard she had slammed it. And then she stalks out of the store, back down the driveway. I keep an eye on her as she walks, and continue to watch as she makes her way back up to the interstate and starts up the northbound ramp, walking off into the night. Almost a year passes. I'm in my bedroom one night, less than a week before my 16th birthday. I hear my dad yelling from downstairs, "Son, get down here and look at this." I quickly run down to the living room and see my dad pointing at the TV. There's a mugshot on the TV of a woman, and it only took me a moment to unscramble my brain and realize that I recognized the photo. It's of that woman that came into the gas station that one evening. Turns out that lady was a woman named Eileen Warnos. A quick Google search will tell you that I almost willingly gave a car ride to one of, if not the only female serial murderer known in the United States that night. She had been arrested at some bar in early 1991 on a weapons charge from several years back. But within a week of being in custody, she confessed to killing 7 different men in the years leading up to this. She was convicted of first-degree murder about a year later and put to death in the early 2000s. It's been 33 years, and even now, I still have nightmares about what could have happened that night. I was ready to just get out on the road, maybe do a good deed for this woman while I was at it. But I'm thankful for the fact that my father both had and paid attention to that unsettled feeling in him, and was unwilling to let his son walk out the door with that strange woman. No telling what the ending would have been. This story occurred back in 2017. Due to a multitude of factors, including a recent death of a close friend, I was unbearably depressed at this time in my life. For that reason, my family flew across the country to visit me in LA, where I live. We thought it would be nice to visit the historic Catalina Island. When we arrived, it became apparent to us that it was the off-season. Being in late November, the weather was cold, and as a result, the island was nearly empty, besides locals and a few straggling tourists such as ourselves. Our first priority was to ditch our luggage so that we could explore this island. So we immediately checked into our motel, although that word hardly does this place justice. I call it a motel because all the doors to the rooms exited to the outside, but in actuality, our room was one of 20, maybe 30 quaint-looking guest cabins, arranged in sort of a horseshoe shape around a walkway, with rooms finding their way to either side of the path. The entrance to the motel was essentially one of the points of the horseshoe, and if you walked dead straight, you'd reach the room that we were given. Basically on the corner before you have to go right to go further into the horseshoe. So from our room, one path led back to the street, the other further into the secluded maze of rooms. I encourage you to stay with me on this. After a day of exploring and having just finished dinner, it was time for the cold, dark walk back to the room. Catalina Island is a decent distance from the mainland, and let me just say, it gets dark. Similarly dark was my headspace after the dinner conversation took a left-hand turn and my overwhelming depression got the best of me. I pulled my black hoodie tighter over my freezing ears and walked ahead of my parents to the room, telling them I just needed to go to sleep. And I did immediately. Depression sometimes makes that easy. I was already losing consciousness as they entered after me, drifting off without so much as a good night. Later on, though, I woke up to my mom saying my name, a harsh whisper. The room had 2 beds, my parents' bed closer to the door, and mine further into the room. My mom's voice cut through the silence again. She sounded concerned this time. I didn't blame her, considering my mental state. Groggily, I rolled over. What? I asked. As my eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight coming in through the curtains, I saw her turn to face me. She was surprised to see me in bed. Her eyes got wide. If I'm in my bed, who was she talking to? We both looked back to where she was previously looking, to see a hooded figure in all black standing over their bed. Now, I know the context that you're listening to the story in. You know that something creepy is going to happen. But I have to underline just how horrifically startling it is to be on an island in the middle of the ocean and wake up to see a hooded stranger looming over you. This particular moment seemed to last a lifetime. Life isn't like the movies, though, where characters unleash a blood-curdling scream. Sometimes The only thing that comes out is something panicked and guttural. My mom's words became low and severe as she said my dad's name in a dire voice that I don't think I'd ever heard her use before. Then the hooded figure did something so bizarre and unsettling. It didn't advance towards us, but instead crouched in the corner near where it stood. The way it crouched was so absolutely unexpected, even in regards to this already unexpected situation, that it terrified me. It seemed almost animalistic. I knew two things. The hooded figure had been standing over us sleeping, and it's not acting in any sort of way that I can understand. As opposed to the infinite moment of this figure standing over us mere seconds ago. The series of events that unfolded when my hulking ex-military dad woke up happened in only an instant. Suddenly, we were out the door, not knowing which way the intruder went. My mom was screaming, "Get him! Get him!" My dad was running down one path of the horseshoe, further into the hotel, shouting through sheer adrenaline, "I'm going to fucking kill you." I ran down the other path towards the street. When I got there, not one sign of the intruder, but it became suspiciously quiet behind me. I ran back to the room to find my dad quietly walking back, his head low. He gets really close to me and I hear him say, "It's a kid. It's a fucking kid." The explanation? Some young teen, tall and lanky as I am, wearing all black including a black hoodie, went into the wrong room. Our room. The one time my parents just so happened to forget to lock the door. My mom woke up when he entered, and seeing a tall person in a black hoodie, thought it was me, assumedly leaving the room in a depressive episode. And when the hooded figure crouched, that was him realizing his mistake, and then panicking. He was scared of us. As I got back to the room, my mom walked out and hugs this kid, who's now crying his eyes out. And let's be real, I would be too if a massive ex-soldier was sprinting after me with murder in his eyes. So, to the now traumatized kid from Catalina Island, I look forward to reading your Let's Not Meet of this same event, only from your perspective. This may be a ramble of thoughts, but after recently stumbling upon this sub, I finally felt a place I could offer something that my family and I experienced a few years ago that to this day gives me a good shiver. I've been camping, solo backpacking, and hunting my whole life in Oregon, and felt comfortable in the woods and have a deep respect for nature. A few years ago, my wife, daughter, and our two German shepherds went camping north of Mount Jefferson, Oregon. I've included the coordinates of our campsite, which we found to be the perfect setup for us and our two dogs, who need the privacy since they are intimidating to other dog owners and can get loud when spooked. It was not an established campsite, just a nice horseshoe off of a U.S. Forest Service road that had flat ground, full trees, and a fire pit. The first night, my daughter wanted to sleep by herself in a two-man tent right next to ours. It was maybe 2 feet away from me and my wife's tent. We had our boy German Shepherd, his name is Guts, sleep with her in her tent. That whole first night, though, neither my wife nor I could find sleep. We both heard footsteps, and they were heavy, not like typical forest critters scampering around the night. I was well armed because, well, I was paranoid. I had read recently, before departing, about a dad in California who was shot and killed in a tent next to his two infant daughters. Needless to say, both my wife and I had two pistols and my rifle with me. The dogs are great at detection, And that is why I felt my daughter could sleep alone, because Guts is completely fearless, and nothing would lay a hand on her without a battle to the death. All in all, nothing but bad vibes and loud footsteps occurred that night, which I ultimately decided was a deer or maybe some elk. Day 2, morning. We go for a walk down the road, and maybe 300 feet away, I see an abandoned road where a rusted gate post was covered in vegetation. Something of blue color caught my eye, and Guts immediately takes off running down this abandoned road. My heart begins to race because I think it's another family camping like us, and he's going to get himself shot or scare some innocent people to death. So I chase after him as fast as I can, and the rest of my family follows. He stops after 20 feet into the road and me yelling his name, but I have covered just enough distance to see that there is nobody there, but there is something off about the sight. I yell, "Hello, is anyone there? Sorry about the dog," but I got no response. My curiosity gets the best of me, and I have to see what the site conditions were. As I get closer, I know something is wrong. It had all the necessities for a campsite, including a cooler, propane burner, tent, blankets, folding table. But every single item had been completely destroyed, smashed and torn from what appeared to be claw marks. We all walked around in circles, puzzled why anyone would leave all their camping gear behind, including an expensive REI tent. I figured, well, someone left in a hurry, and animals got to the rest, is the only logical explanation. Still, a propane tank and cooler were flattened by something, and it certainly wasn't snowpack with tree coverage in that spot. As the afternoon begins to roll in, me and my daughter are playing bocce ball at the campsite, and my wife goes walking maybe 70 feet north to do her business. I do not have a direct line of sight on her, but all of a sudden, I see Guts make a mad dash straight towards her. Normally, he would always be with me, unless he is called over and she didn't call for him. His speed and focus caught my attention, and I knew something weird was happening. So I ran over there, and my wife starts jogging at me. That's when I draw my pistol. Guts has continued his sprint into the forest another 100 feet before I call him, and he stops. My other dog, Leah, who never misses the opportunity to be the pack leader, is not taking point. I've had her for 7 years now, and this was the first time in her life that she refused to leave my daughter's side. She was full hair raised and attached to us at the hip. Again, anytime we hike or play, Leah is up front bossing everything in her path, and then pauses to look to see where we are before continuing. I asked my wife what happened, and she said, "I was trying to pee, and all of a sudden, I felt every hair on my neck raise. I know someone was watching me, and that's when I saw Guts running towards me. I just got up and moved towards you." We spent 10 minutes looking for signs of anything and saw no trails, no broken branches, nothing to point to what and where something went. We decide that we're spending one more night since it's now too late to pack up and drive, but we will all be in the big tent tonight. Before we go to bed, I put a rope with a makeshift coin alarm around the perimeter of our campsite. I used an empty bean can and some coins and keys from our truck, and zip-tied it so anything hitting the rope would give a little jingle. Very unsophisticated, but it put my wife at ease. As I go to tie my last corner off at a tree near our tent, our third mystery item unveils itself. It looks like someone's done the exact same thing I have done, with a rope that was so old and brown that I didn't see it at first. It was broken and only a few pieces remained, but sure enough, It was tied at roughly the same height, 8 to 10 inches off the ground, and even had a few rusted washers on it. I immediately felt someone has stayed here before and put the same makeshift warning system on the same tree I am, maybe 10 or 15 years ago based on the condition of the rope. Perhaps my paranoia had now reached a new height, but I had to make sure the girls felt we were safe. And at the time, the only thing I could think of was that when evening came around, I made them sit in the truck and I fired a clip of my 45 into the dirt as a signal to whatever was out there that we were armed. I reassured the girls that anybody listening to that now knows that we have two wolves with us and we're armed, basically making us too risky to be any sort of target. That way we could sleep safely that night. That evening, though, we heard no footsteps, and the dogs never perked up and barked. We left at first light the next morning. Fast forward to today, and I watched the Amazon Missing 411 documentary. I noticed the cluster smack dab close to where we camped that weekend, and a flood of dread rushed me, as all I could think of was that mysterious abandoned campsite with the ripped tent, smashed cooler, and cooktop. We've been camping since and have enjoyed the beauty of the Northwest, but there was something there at that place that possibly took or harmed someone else less than 300 feet away from where we camped. And we all think our lucky star's Guts was doing his thing so well that afternoon. Like I said, this all happened years ago now. Guts is no longer with us. He's journeyed into the next phase, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about him and how he saved us. He was a warrior, and his new brother, Geronimo, has that same spirit about him. Guts, I really hope you're resting easy, buddy. You deserve it. Just a little bit of context before I jump into the story. When I was 19, I lived with my mom in a ranch-style house on a road that backed up to a very large field. On the other side of our property was the main highway. About a half-mile down from us was this loony farmer, and about a mile in the other direction of us was pretty much a crack house. I guess that at one point someone did used to live there, but it was run down and torn up. Although I will say that the crackheads seemed to stay pretty quiet and to themselves. Other than those two houses, we were pretty much completely isolated. At the time, I was working a full-time job and going to school full-time as well. One of my classes ended at 10:30 p.m. I often wouldn't get home that day of the week until about 11:15ish. I was driving home one night, and I noticed some guy walking down the road. He had a yellow shirt and track pants on. I remember the outfit standing out to me because it just seemed so stupid. It wasn't weird to see people walking down my road because of the whole crack house thing. But as I instinctively looked over at him as I drove past, he turned his head, smiled, and waved, which absolutely freaked me the f out. So I speed the remaining half mile home, pull straight into the driveway, a bit weirded out. I made sure all the doors and windows were secure, and then I sat on the couch to be a paranoid freak and wait to make sure that the dude walked past my house. Except he didn't. And by the time that he got to our property, there was another guy with him, dressed in darker clothes that I couldn't make fun of. They actually walked up my driveway and started playing around with my car, testing the handles and stuff, peering in through the windows. It's then that I realized in my hurry, I had forgotten to grab my phone from the car. So I was a touch worried that that's what they were after, until the guy in yellow started to approach our front door. I'm freaking out now, so I go and wake my mom up. She's bleary-eyed, and I'm trying to explain the whole situation, when we both hear the doorknob turn very slowly. Good thing that it was deadbolted. My mom got out of bed, walked to the front door, and that's when Yellow Shirt Guy knocked. I perched myself up on the couch so that I could get a good look at him and his friend, who was still in the driveway. Our porch light flicked on because it was on a sensor. Yeah, my mom said. A moment of straight silence passed before we hear, You dropped your wallet. I made it very clear to my mom that I had my wallet. It was in my purse. So she calmly says to him that she has her wallet, and that it was too late to be knocking on people's doors. I remember perfectly what he said next, even though this all took place about a decade ago now. Okay, I'm not a bad guy, just so you know. We were all pretty still. No one moved. Not even the guy at the door. Not even when the porch light went off. He just tried the handle again. My mom told me to call the cops, and that she was going to get her gun. I told my mom that I didn't have my phone, had accidentally left it in the car. That's when she walked to the kitchen to grab hers from the charger. She handed me the phone and quickly walked to the bathroom. From where I stood, I could see her stare out the window into the backyard. Then she went to her room to grab her Ruger. I was on the phone with the cops and explaining the situation, all while watching the two guys, explaining that there were two suspicious men at our door, when my mom came back out and said, There's one in our backyard too, which explained why she had looked out the bathroom window. She had caught a glimpse of the other man from the kitchen and went to go get a more discreet look. My mom walked back over to the door with her gun and loudly said, If he tries the handle again, I'm just going to open the door and shoot him. Who knows why she said that instead of waiting for the cops to arrive, but it worked like a charm. The guys took off down the road. I told her, and she rushed to the bathroom, where the guy in our backyard had apparently seen his friends running down the road and decided to sprint off too. They were headed in the direction of that crack house. The cops searched our property and our yard and went to the drug house, where they found 5 dudes just hanging around. One was the Yellow Shirt Guy, and I can only assume that his friends were with him. They got arrested, and nothing weird like that ever happened again. But I was on edge for a while. I still make sure that the doors are locked at all times, every day I'm home, even though I live in a much nicer area now. I know that this story ended a bit anticlimactically, but living it out definitely left both my mom and I unsettled. I still remember the fear that I had in the moment, not knowing what those men wanted and why they were at our door. I've asked my mom about this semi-recently, and without batting an eyelash, she told me that she was scared too, but not the way that I would have thought. She wasn't scared for her safety, or wondering why these guys were at her home. She was scared about what she'd have to do if they tried to get in. Although she made sure to tell me that she wouldn't have hesitated for an instant. At the time that this story took place, my best friend was doing her social media influencer thing. She wasn't big time, but she did have a big enough following to get free stuff and had been privileged enough to get 2 sponsored trips. She still worked a full-time job, but did the IG thing on the side, mostly for the perks, considering that she never made it big enough to live off of. Anyway, this was her first trip. A little boutique hotel from Miami had reached out to her via Instagram and had offered her an all-expenses-paid trip to Miami for Memorial Day weekend. In exchange, she just had to be in the hotel, take a few pictures, do a couple of Instagram stories. She was even told that she could bring a female friend with her if she wanted to, and that everything would be covered for. This was her first time doing this, so at the time, she wasn't really sure of how it worked. They sent her some oddball contract for her to sign, and it said that she'd be responsible for paying for her plane ticket to Miami. and that she'd be reimbursed for it later. This was in essence to prevent a no-show, meaning the influencer gets the ticket purchased by the hotel and influencer never shows up. It seemed reasonable. She invited me, her gay dude best friend, instead of a female friend, because she was nervous about the whole thing. We figured it wouldn't be a big deal, and worst case scenario, if they didn't want to pay for my plane ticket, she'd just cover it for me, and that would be that. We were supposed to be picked up by the hotel at the airport. So our trip day comes, and when we arrive to Miami, there's a guy holding a sign that has both her last name and the hotel logo on it. We're greeted and quickly escorted to a black SUV. Now, here's where things start to get weird. Before we can even climb into the car, the driver, a separate guy, is visibly upset. We thought that he was talking to the guy who had walked us over, but he was speaking directly to my friend. He had a very thick accent and was wearing dark shades. He told my friend that she was not allowed to bring her boyfriend, me, and that she had said that it was two girls. Two girls. Hotel told me two girls. No one girl, one guy, two girls. He was demanding to see where the other girl was. We were both speechless and a bit confused. The guy who walked us to the car looked annoyed. He got in the front passenger seat and started a fight with the driver in Portuguese. At least, I think it was Portuguese, because it for sure wasn't Spanish. Then the passenger turns to us and asks where the other girl is. My friend tells them, very upset by now, that there is no other girl, that she's the model that they contracted with, and I was just a friend coming with her on the trip. The big guy in the passenger seat gets out, tosses our luggage out of the car, and says something like, "This is some bullshit." He gets back in the car, and they take off. That was it. We were in shock, left by the side of the road, right outside of the airport. Utter and complete shock. My friend immediately emails Melissa, the person who was supposedly contacting her through Instagram, the main PR person of the hotel, to tell her what had happened. But predictably, no response. We decide to grab a cab and show up at the hotel. When we show up, everything begins to make sense. The hotel itself had been rebranded and had a completely different name, owner, and staff. We showed them the Instagram account that had reached out to my friend, and it was indeed the Instagram of the hotel that it used to be, but not the one it currently is. Turns out, they never contacted us. They never did anything. Whoever was in charge of the old Instagram account for the old hotel did. Or, more likely, whoever got a hold of that account did. Mind you, this was a somewhat big hotel account. With 10,000 plus followers, it was actually a real account. But upon further inspection, we realized that the pics were really old, and so were the posts. Needless to say, my friend felt like an idiot, and wouldn't stop shedding emotions about it. We called the police, met up with a detective, although nothing ever came out of it. They investigated who was running the account before and who had access to it. But none of the people who used to run that account had anything to do with this. It's both upsetting and terrifying to think that whoever was behind this was actively trying to shield their true intentions behind the facade of a free vacation. What's even more troubling is wondering if this wasn't their first time attempting such a thing. That Instagram account in question has since been deleted, and we never heard anything more from anyone ever again. But to think that my friend would have been kidnapped, or potentially worse, had she gone with another girl instead of me, sends chills down my spine to this very day. I don't remember exactly how old I was, just that I was small enough to fit in the front baby seat of a grocery cart. That had put us in the very late 90s, maybe early 2000s. I was grocery shopping with my mom at a Costco. For those who don't know the chain, it's basically a huge warehouse where everything is sold in bulk, food, clothes, books. It's basically a Walmart, but if Walmart sold cereal boxes in counts of threes, or frozen dinners by the dozen. My mom has a bit of a habit of pulling her grocery cart down to one side of the aisle in stores, and then walking the length of the shelves, picking out what she wants, and then coming back to the cart and dumping what she has in the basket. I don't get why she does it, but hey, moms do weird things, right? So I'm 3, maybe 4, sitting in the front basket playing with my Game Boy Color, when she pulls over next to a fruit display in Costco. She tells me that she's going to go check out what's on sale, and for me to stay put. I wasn't a very fidgety kid, so there was no problem there. She's gone for a couple of minutes. I'm absorbed in Pokemon, so I don't really notice her walk up until the cart starts moving. Being a kid, I instinctively trust that she's the one pushing the cart, but I was wrong. After a moment or two, I catch out of the corner of my vision her red nails. This is something that stood out to me because my mom never painted her nails and never, ever wore them long, like the nails that were wrapped around the handlebar right now. I look up. The lady pushing the cart is a little older than my mother. Same curly black hair, but pulled into a ponytail at the nape of her neck. I still remember she had tanned, Italian type skin with thick red lips, a heavy coat of eyeliner, and brown eyes. She was pretty skinny. Her teeth were yellowed, and she smelled like what I didn't realize until later, bad BO. This wasn't my mom, and I said so, very loudly. She laughed and looked around and pushed the cart just a little bit faster. I said it again, and she looked me dead in the eyes and said, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact wording. Oh, sweetie, what game are you playing? I am your mom. So the way Costco is set up, at least ours, is that in the produce area, instead of aisles, they're more like islands. They're large square setups that you can see the entire length of the produce section if you walk in that area. So of course, I can see my actual mother a few displays away. As loud as I could, I remember yelling, Mom, and watching her head whip around to look at me, right as this lady is trying to cover my mouth with her hand. I don't know if she decided that I wasn't worth it because I was so noisy, or if looking at my mother charging from a few displays over. Side note, my mom is not a petite woman. She's built like a linebacker and played both softball and roller derby throughout college. She's more of an ox than a human woman, but that's what I appreciate about her. But anyway, this woman squeezed her hand around my little face once and then booked it. My mom comes running up to me and starts asking me a million questions at once. My little brain thinks all of a sudden that I'm in trouble for using my outdoor voice inside. Because she looks so mad, I begin to cry. By the time she had calmed me down, that lady was already long gone, and reporting her to the head of security did bupkis. Store never found her inside, and security camera footage showed her leaving through the main entrance. But it didn't catch what car she got in, which way it exited the lot, or if she even got into a car at all. I don't know why she picked me, or what it would have been for, but I'm just glad my real mom ended up scaring her away and that nothing more came of it. So to the lady who tried to kidnap me from the Costco produce section, claiming to be my mother, I hope you found the deodorant on your way out, but I also hope that we never meet again. The story that I'm about to share took place about 5 years back when I was still in my senior year of high school. At the time, my mother and I called Southern California home, and although that has since changed, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time I think about this particular evening. It was fairly late, maybe 8:30 or 9 p.m., We had just walked through the door after a long day of driving and visiting family. But before either one of us could settle in and get comfy at home, we realized that our cat had no food left in the house. We were both utterly exhausted from the day, so the idea of trekking off to Petco for Meow Mix was a bit of a nightmare in my book. While I really didn't want to go, my mother all but pleaded with me to make the trip with her, and after having my arm thoroughly twisted through parental guilt, I gave in. While I was stewing in my own wants to stay home and play Xbox, I had no idea then just how thankful I would be that I ultimately took the drive with my mom. A little more groundwork for the story. My mom drove a 2012 Honda Accord at the time. It was an economical, gas-saving car for my single mom, but she loved that thing. She had personalized floor mats, a nice sound system, and windows tinted so dark that it kind of felt like you were riding in a limo sometimes. I always loved the bass of the subs in the back, but looking back, that tint might have been the sweetest addition to that car. We pulled into the Petco parking lot, where there were only a small handful of other cars spread around the lot. A few right in front of the store, a few more towards the very back of the lot. But only ours seemed to take up the ground in between. My mom knew I wasn't thrilled to be on this journey, so she suggested that I waited in the car while she ran in and quickly grabbed the cat food. I agreed because I didn't really want to go in anyway. She hops out of the car and hustles into the store. But as she does, one of the cars that was parked near the rear of the lot pulled up a few rows and parked in a spot one space over from ours on the passenger side. I remember thinking that that was a bit odd, but as the man in the driver's seat got out, he quickly retrieved his large German Shepherd from the back seat. At that point, I just thought that he was trying to get closer to the store so he wouldn't have to lug his big pooch the length of the lot. But there were so many other spots that he could have taken. Why the spot right next to us? The man and his dog headed into the store as well, but only about as far in as the first set of displays. Dude seemed like he looked at the same end cap of dog treats and chews for 5 or 6 minutes. He only moved away from that stand when he saw my mom coming down the nearest aisle. He jumped into the checkout line right in front of her. Once he was done paying, he stationed himself basically right outside the automatic doors of the store, but positioned slightly to the side so he could glance back in at my mom while she paid. Once she exited the store, that's when he turned and followed her towards the cars. My mom gets to the trunk, pops it, and begins to throw the 2 bags in her arms inside. When the dude next to us does the same. But as he pops open his trunk, I hear him speak to my mom. I can't hear exactly what he's saying from inside the car, but I hear him say something, and my mom then responds. As I look out the window, it looks like he's speaking to her while gesturing towards something in the back of his car. My mom is oblivious to the scene that I've been watching unfold, and she starts to take a few steps towards this weird guy. As she does, I swear I see him begin to lunge forward towards her. Before I can even think, I fling the door open and erupt in the most frantic parental voice that I've ever had to use on my own parent, screaming at her to get her back into the car. I don't know who I startled more, my mom or the creep, because while my mom looked back at me with an annoyed look of bewilderment on her face, the creep practically jumped a foot off the ground. Once I popped out on them, the guy slammed his trunk and hastily said, "Never mind," before beelining for his driver's side door and pulling off without so much as looking at me. I can only assume that when dude pulled up next to us, he didn't see me in the passenger seat due to the dark tints. So when I began to yell, it caught him way off guard that there was someone else in the mix. Once my mom got in the car, I asked her what he was saying to her and why she would walk towards this guy. She said that the stranger had made some comment about something he had just gotten for his dog and invited her over to take a look at it. At that point, I told her everything that I saw, how he pulled up next to us the moment that she went inside, how it seemed like he was watching her, and even how he lingered while waiting for her to pay. I'm convinced that whoever that guy was, he was going to attempt to abduct my mother that evening. Telling the story still causes me to feel my heart in my throat, because I truly feel that had I not been there that night, I may never have seen my mom again. This happened when I was around 17 years old, and is still happening today. At 17, I felt lost in the world and stuck in a job that I disliked, with work colleagues that disliked me. I think that this had to do with my accent, as I was quite well spoken, so they had this idea that I was some rich, snobby kid. It all started on a Friday after work. The factory I worked in had a half day on Fridays, so I would just spend the rest of the day wandering around the city that I lived in. It had been a tough day of relentless mocking, and I was reaching my breaking point. I went around the city looking for a new job. I visited the police recruitment center, the Army, Navy, and Air Force centers, and even the International Red Cross. I just wanted to get away from it all. After a few hours, I had a bag full of career pamphlets and still no idea what to do with my life. I turned a corner and immediately saw a sign sitting right in front of me. I can remember it so vividly now. It said, "Free personality test. Are you curious about yourself? Come in." I then looked up at the building, and on a big, fancy sign outside, it said, "The Church of Scientology." Now, before I continue, yes, I already knew about Scientology, but I had a morbid curiosity about it. I had heard all the horror stories and goings on inside the church. But Tom Cruise was my favorite actor, and he seemed to have his life sorted out pretty well. I feel now that those were some famous last thoughts right there. So I went inside. I was immediately greeted by a very nice lady. She asked me how I was doing and what she could do for me today. I asked if I could speak to somebody about the church and the personality test. She smiled and said, "I would be happy to. Please take a seat, and I'll get you someone to speak to." After a moment, I was introduced to an older man named Alan, and he was the head of my city's Scientology Center. Alan took me to a small room to speak privately. When we entered, I immediately noticed a large picture of L. Ron Hubbard on the wall. We sat down and had a friendly chat. I told him about how I was unhappy about where my life was going. I told him about how I wanted to leave, plus all the trouble that I was having at work. He seemed genuinely concerned for me, and I felt as if he wanted to help. After a while of talking, I agreed to do the personality test. He gave me the test and left the room saying to give the test to the receptionist after I had finished. 2 hours later, I was done. Not joking, that's really how long it took. It was about 500 questions about anything and everything. I handed it in to the receptionist, and she told me it would take some time to process. In the meantime, Alan had told her to take me to their private cinema and show me a film. I thought it was just going to be some old room in the back with a TV on the wall, but no. They did indeed have a private cinema. It could seat around 50 people and had a large screen in the front. It did feel a bit weird just being there by myself, in a cinema owned by Scientology. But I bet that hasn't happened to many people. Or maybe it has. Anyway, I sat down and they played me the film. It was about 30 minutes long and consisted of a narrator explaining those strange feelings you sometimes get, with some mediocre acting following along. I remember a section about how much you doubt yourself, knowing you have a locked door, but going back to check multiple times. At one point, the film showed how a past event that happened to your mother while she was pregnant with you could affect your life in a negative way. Example, your mother was sick on a flight, so now you're scared of flying. I also vaguely remember something about rotten eggs and how much an event involving them can hurt you. I know it sounds absurd, but in some ways, the film really made sense to me. When the movie was done, I was taken to Alan's office and he told me my results. He told me that I was extremely depressed, one of the most unmotivated people he had ever met, lacking cognitive thinking, and I was a waste of talent. Now, this made me very upset. But Alan said that he could help me. He gave me about 4 books and a DVD. He told me to read the books and watch the film before my course. I asked, what course? And Alan told me he had signed me up to do a course at the center. He convinced me that if I didn't do this course, that my life would soon spiral out of control. In addition to that, he made me hand over quite a bit of money for the course and said I would receive an email about the course, which was in a month's time. I left the center, ran home, and immediately started reading the books that I was given. This happened all over the weekend. I had basically locked myself in my room and did nothing but read and reread those books and watch the DVD over and over again. Over the next week, I began taking notes about myself and my family. I emailed Alan with questions and concerns. I started resenting my mother for my life. I began to think that she was the problem, that everything bad that happened to me was the result of her. And I started treating her badly, swearing at her, and did the best that I could to ignore her. When I emailed Alan about my mother, he told me that if she was the catalyst for my problems, then maybe I should consider disconnecting from her. And I took that bullshit seriously. I made plans to totally leave her out of my life. A week before my course, I developed some kind of God complex towards everyone around me. What I read in those books told me what I could become. I saw everyone in my family as below me. I really became a truly spiteful person. Just days before my course, I was confronted by both my mother and father. They said they were concerned about me and that they had searched my room. My dad took out all of my Scientology books and the DVD. I was outraged. I screamed and swore at them. I said horrible things to them. I told them about how I was going to leave them and how I never wanted to see them again. Hours of arguing back and forth, tears and swears. However, in the end, they did convince me that the church was a bad place. They said if I was so miserable at work, I should have told them. And that's true. To this day, I can't believe I didn't say anything to them. Instead, I went to the Church of Scientology. That night, after the arguing had stopped, they sat me down and did their best to comfort me. I really couldn't believe it. After the way I had treated them for the past month, they still cared about me. The next day, I emailed Alan and told him I wouldn't be coming back to the church. He quickly got back to me asking why, asking if it was my family, and if I was being forced to not go. I didn't respond. I ignored him. The emails I received in the next few weeks were mad. Alan told me stuff like I should leave my family now and that I could stay at the church. He tried to convince me that it was all because of my mother. He even emailed me to say something along the lines of, he wouldn't be surprised if he read in the papers that I had ended it all by my own hand. I'm very sure that he crossed the line there, but I just kept ignoring him. The strangest email that I got was one in all binary code. 001101011 this, and 10010101110 that. I used a binary code translator, but it all came back as mixed up letters and numbers. None of it made sense. After weeks of this, I eventually blocked Alan. However, it still hasn't stopped. About 2 or 3 times a year, I'll get an email from the church. It's either asking how I am or asking about my family. When I get them, I immediately block the email address, but they just keep coming. It's always someone new, saying they heard about my case and they were worried about me. The whole reason I'm sharing this is because I just got another email the other day, and I thought that it would make a good warning. Please, I beg of you, do not go to a Church of Scientology center. If they can turn me into a spiteful degenerate in just a few hours, then what can they do with a person in a few months or a year? If anyone has an idea of how to block an entire religion/cult from my email, please let me know. And if you're lost in life, sad, or upset, then please talk to your family, friends, or a doctor. When you're down, don't let others make you into a monster. Take it from me. After this event, I got help, and I find that I'm a much more happy and confident person now. I thank you for listening, and Alan, if you're on the other end of this, you made me into a monster. So for your sake, I hope we don't meet again. For a little context, this happened back in 2001, pretty much right after 9/11. I'm a female, and I was 24 years old at the time, driving by myself across country to get to my son who was with my ex. I had been out of state, taking care of a sick family member. So I'm on the drive, middle of the night, going through New Mexico. I can't remember the route, but I was on a 2-lane highway. And while I can remember seeing cars going the opposite way in fairly short intervals, this was not a densely populated highway by any means. But after a relatively quiet, several-hour stretch of driving down this worn road, I glance up in my rear view and see the unmistakable glow of blue and red lights coming up on me. When you see cop lights in your mirror, all sorts of emotions present themselves. For me that night, a feeling of annoyance because I know that I wasn't speeding or anything of that sort. An exhaustion as I think I was about 9 hours into my trip, and I was maybe 5 miles away from the exit for the hotel that I had planned on stopping at for the night. But I know the expectation, so I pulled over towards the shoulder as the lights get closer and closer to my brake lights. As the cop car pulls off as well, they flip the flashing lights off. And before I know it, there's a cop at my driver's side window, standing there in anticipation, waiting for me to roll it down. Now this, off the bat, seemed a little off. When I've been pulled over in the past on a stretch of road that has traffic flying down it, the cops would usually come up on the passenger side. And although it was late, there were still vehicles driving well over 60 miles per hour down this particular road. He asked for driver's license and registration, which I hand over without incident. Yet, he stood at my window and stared at me for a good 15 seconds before walking back to his car. He returned almost immediately, and that's when he asked me to step outside of the car. That was about the point where I started to get worried. I've gotten tickets before, but being asked to step out of the car was far from the norm for me. I did it though, at which point he asked me if I had been drinking. I replied that I had not been drinking, and quickly asked why I was being stopped in the first place. He said that I was driving erratically, which I knew for a fact was not true. He then flat out asked me if I was a terrorist. I was taken aback by the sheer absurdity of the question, because while I know that terrorists can come in all shapes and sizes, I was young, blonde, blue-eyed, and a veteran with completely valid ID. There was no reason to even ask such a thing. He gave me the walk-the-line drunk driving test, which I passed. He then said that he needed to search my car to see if I had any drugs on me. I thought about this for a minute because I'm aware of my rights and all, but it was so late. I was tired and alone. I just didn't want to deal with the BS of refusing. So I gave him the okay because I knew I didn't have anything in the car. When he got to my trunk, he opened up a small suitcase that happened to have my work clothes in it. Side note, I was an exotic dancer at the time, so you can imagine what I mean when I say work clothes. He asked me about the clothing. I told him that I was a stripper. This admission seemed to really set him off. He began screaming at me about being a trash person. And this absolutely pissed me off and caused me to re-examine the situation with a little bit more depth. Again, tired and alone with this weird guy who appears to be a cop. Every once in a while, a car would drive by, but for the most part, the roads were empty. Middle of the night, and I didn't have anything to protect myself versus this guy that had a gun. He told me then that I needed to walk back towards the tree line that was near the road. I stared him dead in the face and said, no. I demanded that he call for backup, more officers, his supervisor to come. This was something that he was visibly thrown off by. I said that I wanted a female officer and I would no longer be complying with anything that he said. And then I began trying to flag down the few cars passing by at that moment. He told me to calm down, and at this point, he wrote out a speeding ticket and let me go. I opted not to move my vehicle before he took off. I didn't want him seeing where I was going. But it was when he pulled off into the night that I got another bit of a shock. The car that he was in, while it looked like a cop car, it had zero identifying marks of one. No state or county insignia, no lights on the top of the car. And that's when a feeling of dread swept over my entire being. I pretty much floored it to the hotel, and once I was checked in, that's when all the emotions came pouring out. I never paid that speeding ticket, and never heard a word about it either. This happened more than 20 years ago, and at the time, I was really shaken up about it. So much so that I pushed it far down and did my best to forget all about it. But looking back now, I don't believe that was a real cop that stopped me on that lonely highway that night. I think that the only thing that kept me from something bad happening was the pushing back against what he was asking me to do. The moment that I was no longer an easy target, he gave up. Something that I thank myself for every time this memory comes out. I'm glad to say that listening to my gut likely kept me out of something much, much worse. So I implore others to do the same. Listen to your gut. If something feels off, it's because it is. This is a pretty convoluted story, even by my own admission. So bear with me as I try to convey everything I can recall about what led me to the conclusion that my ex-housemate could have potentially been a serial killer, or a serial killer in the making. It was the summer of 2015 when I moved in, and at first appearances, my housemate slash landlord Mike was somewhat normal, if not a bit socially awkward and dysfunctional. When I was signing the papers, he was adamant that I should never go into the basement, which I found odd, but I really needed a place to stay. And, well, people have their little quirks, so I just chalked it up to that at the time. As I got to know Mike and our cohabitation continued, I learned more about the depths of his dysfunction. Firstly, that he used meth. Now, I don't automatically judge people based on their vices, but I was surprised at the extent of his use. He was probably the first person that I ever knew who used meth and balanced a full-time job, enjoying a decent amount of success in life. The reason this is important to the story is that when he would be around the house, drinking and using his drugs, he would start to run off at the mouth. He would often joke that if I smelled lye coming from the basement, not to think anything of it. I think it was maybe the third time that he said this that I finally asked why he kept saying that. That's when he said, I use chemicals to clean up after the bodies, with a wily grin on his face. I tried to chalk that one up to a bad sense of humor, but it didn't sit right with me. He was also very particular that I let him know of my comings and goings of the day, in addition to my work schedule. I remember him being shocked and uncomfortable one day that I ended up taking off of work because he didn't realize that I was home. I remember that day because there was a lot of clanging and what sounded like muffled shouting coming from the basement. His car was in the driveway, but he was not in the main house or his bedroom. Other days, he would play very loud music that bumped through the whole house. Sometimes, he would even play NPR talk radio at those same volumes. In retrospect, I think he may have been trying to mask sounds. He would make remarks about sex workers, saying, you can do whatever you want. You can choke them or beat them to death, and nobody will care. I took exception to this. I told him that I thought that was messed up. But when he would get tweaking, he'd always come back around to alluding to the same kind of violence, talking about how he was a normal white guy who owned a house, and he had a good career, so the police would never suspect him of anything. At this point, I start to think that it has gone too far to simply be a joke. I was in a weird position because money was tight at the time, and my options were few. To try to convince myself that even if he is messed up, he's probably just engaging in outward fantasism. I knew that he would acquire the services of sex workers on occasion, but again, did not judge that activity at face value, although it started to become a concern. At one point, I was doing laundry one night. I caught whiffs of what I can only think of as decomposition. The house we were in was in southeast Portland. It was a relatively new property, and having grown up in upstate New York, I know that animals can become trapped in the walls and die. But this was the garage, and there were no animals scurrying in the walls. This was strange and telling to me. I considered carefully what I would do, and I decided I would confront him about the smell. I decided to pose the question in a somewhat suggestive manner by expanding on his jokes. I told him that he needs to do a better job cleaning up the bodies because I could smell the rot emanating from the garage. I will never forget his reaction. His eyes widened, and he shot me a sharp glare, somewhere between fear and rage. He stumbled over his words and eventually responded, What? Really? I said, Yes, really. And there were a few seconds of awkwardness before he said, Thanks for letting me know, and promptly went into his bedroom and shut the door. A few days after that, he went into the upper crawl space in the garage while I was again doing laundry. He called for me and was trying to convince me to come up into the crawl space with him. My body locked up, and it was like my instincts were screaming at me that if I went up there, I wouldn't come back down. I gave some excuse that I can sparsely remember that I had to be someplace. I packed up my laundry, threw it in my room, and promptly left. He spent a lot of time in the padlocked basement without a doorknob. The only way in was through the backyard. Looking back on this, I wish I would have gone down there to either confirm or dismiss the suspicions once and for all. In the last couple of months that I lived there, I was privy to more graphic comments about women and sex workers, explicit talk of sexual violence, and he was using more and more. He once showed me a video that he made. He's a graphic designer and artist as well, which featured heavy bondage themes. interspersed with distorted audio of women screaming, along with this strange, leering figure in a plague doctor costume. It was one of those situations where any one of these things alone may have been innocuous, but as they accumulated, it became suspicious to me. It was October of 2016 when I finally left there, taking off to the Ocheti Oyate camp during the anti-pipeline protests with Standing Rock, Lakota. It was a feeling of being called to action and having nothing else to lose, as I wanted to get out of that house in the worst kind of way. My last night there, I didn't give notice that I was leaving. He was drinking and tweaking once more. He started in on the same conversation, loosely describing murder and violence towards women in the tone of some sort of edgy joke. I told him that he would be caught eventually, not even holding back my suspicion anymore. He reiterated that he was the last person police would suspect, and asserted that nobody would be catching him. He said this in a very serious and concise way, dropping the pretense that he had been using before. I left the next morning. Now this haunted me for months, then a year, then a year and a half. I felt as though I hadn't done anything. The guilt was just eating away at me. So that's when I called Portland Crime Stoppers and put in an anonymous tip describing the situation that I had left. When I did, the operator started going back and forth, putting me on hold, because the call had piqued the interest of the police sergeant who was assigned to the call center. So they began asking me detailed questions about his vehicle, the house, the methods that he described, things like that. It really seemed like they took an interest. I gave them as much information as I could remember and left it at that, feeling just a little bit better that I had at least tried to do something about it. Fast forward to recent times, when I told my mother about all of this, and she too became interested, asking what house this was, what was the address, and then she ended up pulling it up on Google Maps. She brought up the street view, and I noticed there was a large enclosed trailer in the driveway that wasn't there when I was. I could theorize why it might have been there, but can't put together a practical reason for it, or why he'd be using it, unless he was moving or using it to haul things to discard. Admittedly, that is all pure conjecture, but I couldn't help but wonder. I doubt that I will get closure or have my suspicions validated unless he does finally get caught and arrested, and I happen to read about it. I've grown up poor and been around lowlives a lot in my life. I've interacted with many sketchy and unsavory people in my time, but none of them have ever made the impression that Mike made on me. Make of it what you will, but I hope I never meet him again. This happened a few nights back, so I still find myself replaying it over and over in my head. I thought that this would be a good place to share. I'm a pretty predictable person with a predictable routine schedule, so I'm not sure if this was a random occurrence or if someone knew my nightly routine. I'm a 35-year-old woman. My husband, Rob, gets up for work hours before me, so he often goes to bed before I do. I usually get to bed a few hours after he does, around the same time every night. I turn off the lights and TV in the living room and take my dog to the back door to let her out. She's tiny, old, and poses zero threat to anyone. The door itself leads to a large deck outside. Off to the right of the deck are a few steps down and a small path to the gate, which we always keep chained and locked. Every single night before opening the door, I've developed a habit. I peek out the window right next to it without disturbing the blinds and flip on the deck light. Not sure where this came from, but it's nearly an OCD level tic now. I never expect anyone to be there, and we've never had a problem with anyone trespassing or trying to break in. It's just something that I do every night. Kind of like taking looking behind the shower curtain before you pee. We all know no one is back there, but if you don't check, then that's going to be the one time that there actually is someone hiding there, you know? So a few nights ago, it's about that time of night. I got ready for bed, went to the back door with my dog slowly following behind me, peeked out the window, and flipped on the light. Only this night, my heart jumped into my throat when I saw a skinny, dirty guy in his 30s standing off to the side of the door, looking directly at it. I see him raise his arm up and hold what looks to be a screwdriver above his head as soon as the light flicks on, as if he were preparing for someone to open the door. Some people say they freeze for a moment when faced with some sort of crisis, but not me. I immediately screamed, "Rob, get up, get the gun," as loud as I could, which seemed to startle the guy outside. He jumped over the rail of the deck and hit the ground with a thud, even though he was right next to the stairs. I heard impact on the gate down the stairs as well, which gave me every indication that whoever this guy was, he was now running off into the night. My husband ran out of our bedroom with his gun, which I give him full credit for doing after being awakened from a dead slumber by his screaming wife. He called the police, and they showed up within 5 minutes. They ended up driving around the neighborhood trying to find the guy, but no luck. When they took my statement, I gave them every detail that I could recall in the 2 seconds of seeing the guy, but it wasn't much. While I very much got the feeling that these cops wanted to help, the realization that they likely weren't going to be able to find this creep is most likely what swept over them. Turns out, the guy broke the lock on our gate to get in. He had also pried open the back screen door, which we always kept locked as well. If I would have opened the door without looking out first, I might have let him right in, or I may have walked into an attack meant for me. I don't know if I caught the guy trying to break in, or if he was waiting for me to open the door like I do every night. Either way, it was f***ing terrifying. My parents are buying us outdoor security cameras this week as an early birthday present for Rob and as a deterrent for any other neighborhood creeps that might get the same idea the first creep did. Glad we never did come face to face, but that was still a close enough call for a couple of lifetimes in my book. I came over to the United States from Serbia at the age of 13 with my mother. My older brother, who's 15 years older than me, had lived in America for a few years, and he had finally sent for us. We had long hoped to be reunited as a family, so we were particularly excited to make the journey. We arrived in New York City, and the plan was for my brother to come get us from the airport. However, his wife was 9 months pregnant at the time, and my niece decided that she couldn't wait for us before she made her own arrival into the world. My brother couldn't leave his wife, so he asked a coworker of his, a fellow cab driver, to pick us up in the city and drive us to New Jersey where he and my sister-in-law lived. When we got to New York City, we waited in customs for what seemed like forever. We looked out for my brother, but didn't see him. This was the early 90s, and cell phones weren't as common. And even if they were, my mom and I didn't have one. We panicked a bit, not seeing my brother or my sister-in-law, when suddenly we heard our names being called and saw a tall man. He introduced himself in perfect Serbian and explained that he was a good friend of my brother's, and then told us about the baby. He said he'd be driving us the 2 hours from the airport to my brother's home. My mom relaxed a bit, and they happily began to converse about the baby and my brother and America. I, however, just felt a bit off. This guy gave me bad vibes, and regardless of my brother's friendship with him, I instantly felt a feeling of distrust. We drove for a good hour and a half when he announced that he was going to take us for breakfast. We hadn't eaten in over 15 hours, so we were starving. We pulled up to a house, which was something that both my mom and I were confused by. He insisted cheerfully that his wife was cooking us breakfast, And after we'd eaten, he'd drive us the rest of the way to the hospital to see my family. My mom shushed me when I whispered something didn't feel right and told me that we needed to be grateful for the hospitality. We were led into the house. It was dark, dank, and dirty. And as we're being shown around this ragtag dwelling, I think my mom finally got a bit nervous herself and began insisting that the man take us to my brother. That's when the guy grabbed my mom by the wrist, telling her that he needed a wife to take care of him and his house. Apparently, when he heard my brother tell the others at work that she'd be coming to stay, this man said that he knew that he'd found a wife. At that time, I was a scrawny little scamp of a kid, and even though I tried pushing him off my mom, he hit me so hard that I saw stars. At this point, we were terrified. Neither of us spoke English. The only phone number we knew was my brother's home number, and he was at the hospital. Also, in Serbia, you don't dial 911, so even if I could, I didn't know that's how to call the police here. This man tells my mom she's to clean and cook for him, and he takes me to the basement, where I was locked in what I now know is called the laundry room. I banged and cried and yelled, but it was so far down in the basement that everything was muffled, and I'm sure no one outside could hear me. For a week we were kept in his home. He'd lock us up in the basement after my mom cooked him breakfast, and he'd let us out when he'd come home at 4. If we had to use the restroom, there was a bathroom in the basement, but that's it. Just a bathroom and laundry room. It was freezing cold down there too, and even with us huddling together under a blanket, it did nothing. On our 8th morning down there, I discovered a small window by climbing on some boxes. I managed to force it open, and my mother insisted that I squeeze through it. I didn't want to leave her, and I couldn't figure out how I'd be able to get us help. I couldn't speak the language, nor could I read it. However, I knew that I didn't want to live this way the rest of my life, so I did as she asked. I ran once I got out, and I bet that I was quite the sight. A scrawny boy with no shoes, only wearing shorts and a t-shirt in the middle of November. But I'm sure that that's at least partially what saved us. Several concerned neighbors tried to get me to come to them, although I wouldn't. I was terrified. I just kept trying to get them to follow me. The police were eventually called, and a very nice policeman tried to get me into his car. But that's when I saw the man who'd taken us drive up in his taxi. He saw me with the cops and promptly took off. That's when I made a run for the house. I knew I had to get back to my mom. Needless to say, the cop and his partner ran after me, and after making entry into that awful home, my mother was rescued. It took another 4 hours for them to find someone who spoke our language, for us to tell them what had happened. A warrant was issued for the man. My brother was contacted. Turns out that his friend had told him we never showed, and my brother had been frantically calling everyone back home in Serbia trying to find us. My brother drove up to get us and to give the cops information on his supposed friend so that they could find him, but they never did. From what I understand as an immigrant, it was much easier to simply fall off the map as a foreigner pre-9/11. This act made me distrustful of people and their intentions for a long time afterwards. My mom grew homesick, and she ended up going back to Serbia. I stayed here with my brother and finished school, then later attended the police academy. I don't know if I would have chosen that path had I not met the nice officer that helped us all those years ago. I think of that guy who kept us prisoner every now and then, and honestly, I wouldn't mind meeting him now. I just don't think he'd want to meet me. This story took place in 2010. My child was 4 years old, and I'm 100% sure that my kid prevented something terrible from happening to me that day. Sort of a funny yet not funny twist to all of this is that this story was adapted into a Law and Order episode with a terrifying ending. By way of background, I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which has the honor of being one of the most racially segregated cities in the country. It's a cool city overall, but we have a really shitty inner city with a ton of poverty and violence and gang activity. At the time that this happened, I was living in sort of an in-between area. Not the hood, but far from a super nice area either. I was a 22-year-old single mom. I lived in a ground floor apartment on one of the main streets of the city. When I'd arrive home from work, I'd park in the back alley behind my building. My front door faced the street, and I had a side door too, with a walkway running between my building and the one next door. Anyway, one day I got home in the middle of the afternoon on a Saturday with my kid. As we drove down the alley to get to my parking spot, I saw a guy in a hoodie sort of lurking around the area where I parked my car. It was weird because it was warm outside, yet he had his hood up. But there were a bunch of ne'er-do-well kids in the neighborhood, so whatever. It was definitely an odd place to just be standing though. As I got close to the building and started pulling into my parking spot, he turned around and started walking towards the street, past my side door. He definitely left because I arrived. I figured that maybe he was just smoking a blunt or something. I didn't think anything further of it. I got my son and some bags out of the car, went the same way the guy had just taken to get to my side door. I didn't see him at all. My son and I went inside, and I was in the process of putting stuff down when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but my mind immediately thought that it was this guy. Being young and naive, I answered the front door. It was indeed the same guy, still with his hood up. He smiled at me, but not in a super friendly way, more of a leer. He looked to be about 16, cornrows, fake gold grill that was studded with little fake diamonds. I regretted opening the door, but here I was, so I just went with it. Hi. He kept staring at me, yet said nothing. At this point, I saw another kid in a hoodie pacing behind him on the sidewalk and looking at us. I was quickly realizing that this was not a good situation. My son, who I had momentarily forgotten about, came up behind me. He did the shy kid thing where he stood behind me and poked his head out from behind my butt to look at the guy. Hoodie dude looked at him for a good couple of seconds, and then trained his attention back at me. Yo, is Danielle around? I don't know who that is. Maybe try the other door. I gestured to my neighbor's door to my left. Oh, you sure? Yeah, sorry, and go to close my door. As I do, he leaves, walking in the opposite direction of my neighbor's door. Hoodie dude number 2 happened to follow him. I thought it was really weird that they didn't even try to check next door for Danielle. I thought the whole thing was really weird. My boyfriend got to my apartment a few minutes later, and I was glad to see him. He had this really old Jeep that he always parked out front on the main street. When he went out to go get something from his car shortly after he arrived, the car was gone. Now, car theft was a pretty common thing in this neighborhood, but stealing it from the main street in broad daylight, well, that was pretty ballsy. So we called the cops, filed a report, the whole nine. I told the cop about hoodie dudes since it seemed like it could be important. I was able to give a good description of the guy who came to my door asking for Danielle. I had no idea if it was relevant, but the fact that the Jeep was stolen shortly after these guys were around made it seem pretty relevant. And that's where the story pauses for a couple of days. I got a call from a different cop with the downtown precinct. He told me that they had found the Jeep, and other than the ignition, the car was in perfect working order. He asked if I could come downtown to do a lineup, see if I could identify the people who had knocked on my door right before the Jeep got taken. That was weird. A lineup for a stolen car? But I agreed. He asked if I could come down in a couple of days. Also weird. Why wouldn't they want me to do it right away? But I was mostly focused on the fact that doing a lineup was pretty cool. So I go to the downtown precinct a couple of days later. The way this went seemed sort of unorthodox, but it was what it was. Two detectives took me into a dark room where a woman in her 50s was sitting with a young woman in a wheelchair. The young woman's lower leg was in a giant cast with this whole metal contraption surrounding it, with maybe a dozen metal rods going into the cast itself. At this point, I had no idea what was happening. The detectives instructed us that we weren't to say anything during the lineup, except if we wanted the guys to turn to their left or right or something like that. But we most definitely couldn't talk to each other at all. Okay, we ended up having to wait in the room for almost an hour, in the dark, awkwardly not speaking. They explained it was taking more time than anticipated to get 12 guys from the jail over to the precinct. Finally, we got started. They did 2 lineups and gave us forms to mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. There was a large window in front of us, and they explained that the guys wouldn't be able to see us. They turned the lights on in the room behind that window and brought each guy in individually. I couldn't identify anyone in the first lineup. I sort of felt bad actually, but I couldn't. The second lineup started, and I didn't recognize guys 1, 2, or 3. Number 4 came out though, and I immediately recognized the dude who had knocked on my front door. He didn't have his stupid grill in anymore, but it was definitely the guy. After the second lineup was done, they brought the other 2 women into the hallway and told me to stay put. After a few minutes, they came back to get me. The detectives asked if I recognized anyone, and I told them that I was sure about number 4 in the second lineup, although I couldn't identify anyone in the first. I had gathered by this point that Hoodie Dude number 2 had likely been in the first lineup, but I hadn't gotten a good look at him when he was pacing on the sidewalk. They had me sign 2 forms, one for each lineup, with the second form identifying number 4 as Hoodie Dude number 1. When I gave the forms back, the detective told me that he could tell me what was actually going on now that the lineup was done. Good, because I was officially confused as fuck by this point. He explained that number 4 was indeed one of the guys they arrested with my boyfriend's Jeep. The guys had stolen the Jeep and driven to a nearby part of town, into a quiet and lily-white neighborhood. For what it's worth, I'm also white, and this is relevant. They came across a young couple unloading groceries from their car. The young woman with the leg contraption was the female half of that couple. They parked the stolen Jeep behind the couple, got out, and immediately shot them both. They shot the woman in the leg, and they shot the young man in, well, the man parts. He was still in the hospital in bad condition, which is why he wasn't there. The older woman was the girl's mom, and had brought her from the hospital just to do the lineup. The reason that it was delayed a couple of days was because the girl had to have emergency surgery to try and fix the damage to her leg. The guys didn't demand anything from the couple or take anything from them after the shooting. They just immediately shot them. The young woman managed to remember the license plate number of the Jeep, and the suspects were apprehended in a corner store when a cop saw the stolen car parked outside shortly after the shooting. Both shooters were teenagers, yet both were being charged as adults. One of them had stupidly talked a bit before lawyering up, and had told a detective that this was a gang initiation. They had to shoot a white person. That was the price of admission. They had stolen my boyfriend's car after taking the bus out to the street that I lived on. They had figured that it would be easier to get away if they had wheels. The detectives were pretty sure that I had been the original target of opportunity, but couldn't explain why they hadn't gone through with it. I knew why. It was because he saw my kid peeking out from behind me. They told me I might have to testify if the case went to court, and told me that I'd hear from the DA's office when they needed me. A couple of months later, one of the detectives called me and told me that the hoodie dudes pled out to attempted murder charges in exchange for reduced time. I never asked how many years, but I assume that they're probably still in prison 13 years later. And for those who wonder, the guy who got shot in the nether region survived. As an ironic postscript to this story, my boyfriend had the same Jeep stolen from the same spot in front of my apartment about 4 months later, also in broad daylight. That time, the authorities didn't find it right away. He was staying over at my house weeks later when he got a call around 2 a.m. from the arson unit. Whoever had taken it had torched it and left it in the middle of the street in a notoriously violent area of the city. I moved shortly after that. It was Christmas time a year or two back when this story unfolded. My wife and I were staying at her childhood home where her mother now lives all alone. Well, not if you include all the cats. The house was on a quiet cul-de-sac in the suburbs. If you're picturing freshly mowed lawns, American flags, and empty sidewalks, you're picturing it right. It's a single-story home with an attached garage out front. The garage has two doorways, apart from the electric garage door, of course. One leads to the garden and backyard. This door has an old doggy door from their days with dear old Max. Side note, R.I.P. Max. They had covered that doggy door with a piece of nailed-in wood. That had always made me slightly uncomfortable before, but I figured it had been that way for years, so what's the worst that could happen? The second door from the garage leads to the kitchen. Hollow core door. It could stop a mouse, but not much else. Definitely not something that wanted in, or someone. We were sound asleep in my wife's childhood bedroom at the front of the house. 3 a.m. I was in that deep, dark recess of sleep. You know, you're in the diving bell, and you're submerged hundreds of meters below the surface in black water, protected from the real world by miles of nothingness. But that's when I heard it. The scream. What are you doing? It was my mother-in-law's voice, echoing down the hallway. To me, lost in a sea of sleep, it sounded like a jet engine roaring right past my eardrum. I bolted up. What happened next happened in a matter of seconds. But about that scream, even though I was dead asleep, I heard enough of it to sense an urgency behind it. This wasn't an, oh, you scared me type of scream. This was different, and I knew it. Not consciously, but my lizard brain, that piece we retained from our primitive ancestors, knew that something was wrong. I watch and read a fair amount of true crime, and this scream awakened that horrible fear within me. The one that says, this can't really be happening to me, can it? Honestly, in that second of the night, it sounded like someone was about to be murdered. You ever wonder if you're a fight or flight type of individual? I always have, and I came to know something about myself after this night. I'm a fighter. I leaped out of bed, growled, yes, growled, in the manliest voice I could muster. I'm gonna kill you, mother, and took off running. I tore open the bedroom door and ran into the hallway. There, at the end, I saw my mother-in-law, nightgown on, look of utter shock on her face, standing as still as a mannequin. We make eye contact as I continue towards her. Then she turns her head, looks directly into the kitchen. I hurry past her and round the corner into the kitchen. The hollow core door is absolutely obliterated, shards everywhere. I look through the open frame and see that the electric garage door is open. I push ahead. As I run into the garage, I hear it. The sound of someone hopping into a running car just out of view. And just as I make it out onto the driveway, I can see a car peeling out from the sidewalk adjacent to the house. but my adrenaline is still pumping. And who am I to say no to adrenaline? So, like an idiot, I run, barefoot, after the car. I give it a good go, but I'm no Usain Bolt, and even he couldn't catch a speeding car. It soon vanishes down the street, and I'm left all alone. The police showed up within a few minutes, which, I have to say, makes me feel a lot more at ease with my mother-in-law living there. They took our statements. My mother-in-law said she heard a noise, the hollow core door being kicked in, and walked into the kitchen where she encountered the burglar, a small framed woman. The police theorized she was working as a part of a team. Her job was to squeeze through the doggy door, kick in the hollow core, and open the electric garage door for her accomplices. I'd say that this was backed up by the fact that when my mother-in-law came face to face with this woman burglar, she could easily see the large, dark silhouettes of two people behind this woman, still waiting to push in from the garage. According to the police, the burglar team most likely thought that nobody was home. Fortunately, my mother-in-law must have caught them off guard and scared them, in addition to my manly growl, of course. But it feels good to know that everyone is safe, and to learn that I guess I've got a little fight in me. And for the record, we bought the heaviest damn wooden door you've ever seen to replace that hollow core. I'd like to see a mouse try and get through that. My goal in sharing this story is twofold. One, to remind everyone to stay safe out there. And two, don't forget to practice your growls. There's no telling when they may come in handy. TV shows and movies usually depict abductors driving white or black vans.